and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Kerwin Institute Forum Series. We're super excited to have you guys all here today. This is our first forum of the new academic year, so we're so happy to have you guys all here. Whether you are in the room, not on the room, in the room or online. So my name is Dr. Jordan Cox. I'm the Associate Director of Research here at the Kerwin Institute. And it is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to our three speakers today. So we have Dr. Jill Clark, Kip Polly, and Glennon Sweeney, who will be presenting today on the topic of inclusive civic engagement environments, results from theory to practice. So I'm going to take a little second, just one, and introduce our speakers. So first I'll start with Glennon. So Glennon Sweeney actually is a senior community outreach analyst here at Kerwin. Her expertise lies at the intersection of land use and development policy and metropolitan segregation with an emphasis on suburban spaces. Glennon works to build strategic partnerships here at Kerwin that advance our community engaged research strategies and does a lot of work with community engagement, local history tours, webinars, and helping non-academic communities understand Kerwin's research. She's been at the Institute since 2012. Kip Polly, formerly a part of the Kerwin Institute as well, so you'll see a trend, is an independent consultant and the sole proprietor of Kip Polly Consulting, LLC. He works to consult nonprofit, for-profit, and governmental organizations on issues related to racial equity within organizational operations, activities, as well as facilitating dialogues and learning opportunities related to racial equity and community engagement. As I mentioned before starting his practice, they work at Kerwin as a research associate for 12 years. So he has a lot of experience in internal knowledge. His areas of focus include evaluation, assessment, research, and practice with the lens of racial equity, as well as designing and facilitating organizational assessments and evaluation projects informed by racial equity research. In particular, Kip is really well known for his guide, Principles for Equitable and Inclusive Civic Engagement, which if you have not already read it, I highly recommend that you read it. Last but not least, we have Dr. Jill Clark, an associate professor of city and regional planning at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs here at OSU. Her research focuses on agri-food system policy and practice, centering on community and state governance and food systems, the policy process, and community engagement. She primarily uses a community-based research approach where she works with local communities across the United States. She holds a lot of leadership positions, including the Ohio Network of Food Policy Councils, national leadership as an advisory board member for the Johns Hopkins Food Policy Network, the international leadership as a part of the International Advisory Committee for the Center of Sustainable Foods and Systems at Wilfrid Laurier University. So we are super lucky to have this conversation today, to be able to host this conversation as part of our forum series here at Kerwin. As a little bit of housekeeping, we do have attendees in person as well as online. So we ask that you hold all of your questions until the end of the presentation, after which we will have a Q&A. For those online, please post your questions in the chat, and Marissa, who is maintaining the chat, will answer your questions or ask your questions on your behalf. So once we get to the Q&A section, just wait for Marissa to ask your questions on your behalf. So with that little bit of housekeeping, I will now turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Jordan, thanks for having us here today. I'm going to go ahead and get started. What is that? There we go. So, place matters, right? Decisions about land use have always been. Part of that is because place is really important. We tend to form emotional attachments. They're connected to our identity. So when that place is up for change, it can seem threatening to people. It's also places are connected to our livelihoods, our resources. A lot of times we might own homes in places. And Around the turn of the 20th century, realtors in this country, yeah, I call this the midwife, started to propagate a lot. People with a mixing of racial and social class. And they did that without any empirical. In fact, we've only had a couple studies that can empirically show that happens. And that's only when you build public housing in an area of concentrated poverty. But otherwise, mixed income does not harm property values. The mixing of races does not harm property values. So most Americans still believe that to this day. And so a lot of people view density, a lot of change, particularly in our region right now, is related to densification as a threat to their property value. That density usually makes property values. And so people have a lot of misconceptions and they have emotional attachments. So land use decisions are really important, right? But there's also an equity in who engages in land use decisions. And so this is a really great book. I highly recommend reading it. It's not that long, called Neighborhood Defenders. But what they found, they were looking at who engages in public, like in planning-related public participation meetings in Massachusetts, where they had like actual data of who these people were. And what they found is that the people who most frequently engage and tend to kind of co-opt the meetings aren't representative of the broader population. They're more likely to be white. They're more likely to be male. They're typically older. They're typically homeowners. And they're typically wealthy and more conservative than the majority of people in their community. And they co-opt these spaces and they have very clear objectives. And those tend to be around stopping the laying and reducing the number of units developed in the community. So we know these things are going on in public meetings around land use decisions. And I don't see what our next slide is. I don't remember yet. Okay, yeah. And the other thing we have going on is that there's been a change in kind of our culture nationally, right? Like facts are now disputed and debated. And we could see that very clearly in the debate last night. Every time one of the candidates were talking, saying he's lying, but she's lying, right? What they just said is not true because facts are up for debate. And the tenor tone of public engagement, we become hostile. There's a lot of conflict in these meetings. And this leads to deepening distrust of public institutions, where in a lot of neighborhoods that experience disinvestment, there's already deep distrust of public institutions. You have all these things going on in civic engagement spaces. And that kind of led us to want to explore. So when we look at the history of Columbus, we look at the key development. I'm actually going to look here so I can see what actually each slide says. We see that like in the early 1900s, right, we had the Great Migration and it really changed the demographics in Central Ohio, particularly in that early wave. We started to use racial and other exclusionary covenants and property deeds at that time and started to kind of enforce and create segregation. In the 30s, we had the Homeowners Loan Corporation Act, and then Columbus had the redlining maps released, right? And so disinvestment followed in those neighborhoods that were graded D, which was red, and yellow, which is C. Or C, which is yellow, sorry. By the 50s, we had highway development. We also had nationally Brown v. Board. And then in Central Ohio, in response, or in Ohio, actually, in response to Brown v. Board, the state separated school district and municipal annexation, which is essentially how Columbus got around Brown. And so it created, if you've ever noticed, the city of Columbus school district is really small compared to the city of Columbus, because about 40% of the people living in Columbus attend suburban school districts. Because when this law happened, essentially, Columbus was annexing what they annexed went to Columbus City Schools. After this law, they annexed, and they're like, well, that neighborhood's like, actually, we're also adjacent to Worthington Schools. We're going to go to that too. Right? Or Western. Oh, what did I do? Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry.
I think you're.
Touch playing with this. I'll stop playing with it.
Oh, we're into.
I said you got some date here better if you want.
Well, I don't like standing on the podium, but I will for you guys. I will for you guys, even though I don't like standing in one spot. It's not natural for me. So you have all of these dynamics going on, and this impacts Columbus neighborhoods, right? By the 1960s, you have a national advocacy planning movement happening. In the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. You also have highway development that started in the 50s and really hits home in Central Ohio in the 60s, right? And we start to see residential development, new housing being built, really in the common areas, which are those areas that are Columbus but suburban schools and in the suburbs of Central Ohio. So at this point, City of Columbus residential development is almost a red line. All right, there's not a lot going on there. By the 70s, you start to see area commissions. Our first two area commissions was Franklinton in 1973, and then the Near East Area Commission in 1979. Also in 1979, the Columbus City School District was found to have an enclave of all Black schools on the Near East Side, and was forced to start busing and desegregate 25 years after Brown v. Board. And then when we get into the 80s, you have the win-win agreement in 1986. This recoupled school district transfers with municipal annexation. And so there are no new common areas being created, but now you have pockets of Columbus City schools, like way out past Hilliard, out in the boonies that are driving through Hilliard and places like that to come to schools in Columbus. Also in the 1980s, the city of Columbus really started to intentionally develop in those common areas denser housing. So they started to try and create housing choice in those areas and more affordable options for people to move and start deconcentrating poverty from the central city. And so that was a Columbus development. Did you have a question there? Did you have a question?
No.
Oh, you're just exercising your hand. Got it. You're good. And so advocacy planning is really what led to the area commissions in Columbus. So prior to this, planners were really going off of the rational model for planning, where the planner is seen as a technical expertise who really their job is to persuade politicians and city officials to do, what is the right thing because they're the experts essentially in planning. The advocacy planning movement kind of said, wait a minute, it was heavily influenced by the civil rights movement. And it said, wait a minute, we should be using our expertise to the benefit of marginalized people, right? We should be helping those communities plan. And so it kind of shifted the model of how planning was being thought about and how people were thinking about, engaging the public around planning issues. And in Columbus, that led to the creation of area commissions. And it was heavily influenced. So like Sherry Arnstein was one of the people who was part of the advocacy planning movement. She created this ladder of public participation that really kind of talks through the different ways in terms of non-participation, tokenism, and then degrees of citizen power and engagement that was heavily influential in how planners thought about planning at this time. And so then we have area commissions that started in the 1970s, and they have very distinct purposes. To help create plans and policies to guide development, to bring neighborhood needs to the attention of city officials, to make recommendations about neighborhood solutions, and to promote effective communication between city and individual neighborhoods. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Jill, who's going to talk a little bit about our research design.
Yeah, so this history, knowing who is showing up and who's not showing up, and knowing that showing up is just part of the equation. We can start talking about the difference between representation and inclusion, right? It led us to ask the question, well, what does an inclusive environment look like locally? And what are the qualities that, if we want to improve these environments, what should we be looking for? And so that led us to our question. We wanted to base what we were doing in with good theoretical grounding. And so using the conceptual framework to examine policy implementation, because essentially the area commissions are policy implementation of the city. And so we're studying, policy implementation, and policy implementation is carried out in this very complex environment. It's happens across field. It's nonlinear. In a lot of ways, it's like an ecosystem. So we can think of like a policy ecosystem, if you will. And within that ecosystem, you have groups of people that are organized to collectively act. And so borrowing from sociologists, and I know we have a resident sociologist in the room, so any questions about theory, I'll pass off on to Greg. People are organized in what are called strategic action fields to act together. They're working from shared knowledge of each other and general understanding of their purpose, and with spoken and unspoken rules about how policymaking and implementation happens. And there's at least three noteworthy things to to thinking about strategic action fields as a concept within a policy implementation system. First, there are fields that are organized around the delivery of a public service. The people in these fields transform inputs into outputs. Second, there are going to be variations of power within those fields. Some people are going to have more knowledge and resources. But despite those power differences, there is usually a shared understanding of what's possible and what's legitimate. So if we take this idea of the ecosystem and think about fields and relate that to area commissions, we could talk about how these fields of collective action are really to be organizations in a policy implementation system. And that there are lots of organizations involved in the work of area commissions. There's the city's Department of Neighborhoods, for example. There are individual area commissions themselves. Yeah, I know. Is that good? Okay, good. All right. No, yeah, I'm good, thanks. They seem to, so we have the area commissions themselves, and each organization has its own field, and the connections between them make up this broader constellation that we would call the policy field. And so each organization, though, is taking that policy, that city policy, and interpreting it to provide that public service. And there are some drivers of what that impact implementation and that interpretation. First of all, there are the laws and regulations that are out there, right? And here we can think of like how area commissions are codified in the city. That's the political authority. There's an economic authority that's derived from demand of services. And the way we could think about this is for area commissions, how many applications do they have for development? Like that's a good proxy for demand of services. There are shared beliefs and values that act as a cognitive framework. And there are then the resulting practices and the norms that shape what's possible. And I mentioned earlier, that within these fields of organizations, there are power differentials, but the visible norms and practices are going to come from the dominant group or dominant people that have the most power. It tends to follow those in power. So we start to think, okay, here's one organization. There's some forces that are impacting it. They're all coming together to influence implementation. We can start to put these together. And this would be kind of like a very simplistic representation of the policy field around area commissions. You need collective action, not just within each organization, but between. You can see the lines connecting these organizations all the way down to the citizens that show up and are showing up because they have maybe some set of expectations of what the environment is like. So we'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Arguably, the cultural frame is playing a really important role in how those laws and regulations get interpreted, how market forces or the demand for services are dealt with, and then those visible practices that we see. And if that's the case, then we can start to see how, even with the same law, you would have different environments depending on which area commission you're in, because they each have these forces at play. There's also differing relationships within the policy field from one area commission to the city versus another area commission to the city, which is going to impact. What I'm going to do is pass it over to Kip, who's going to talk a little bit about the cultural frame, and that kind of interpretive process is so important. Then let's enliven that. What does that look like? How can we describe it? I'm going to pass it over to Kip to talk about that.
You got it. So we used a lot of those same ideals of behaviors and norms and ideals and how they affect sort of power relationships within an organization. And we use those for what we call the civic engagement framework. This is something I started working on when I was here at Irwin to really explain how different voices ended up being seen differently within the community. I mean, we've all been to a community meeting, and they all just feel different depending on time. City council meeting feels different than like a community meeting. It feels different than like a focus group or a community conversation. It feels different than interaction we might have at a community festival on front porch. All of those are community and civic engagement and public engagement, but they feel differently, and whose voice matters and how they matter are different in all of the different settings. And one of the things I started to look at was some of the things that Joe was talking about in terms of what are the behaviors and norms and practices that are inherent to some of these ideals, and how they affect the way that different people or different ways of communicating or even different topics are seen, and how does that play into things like inequality and community voice and people having a seat at the table and not having a seat at the table, and whether that can be seen as legitimate or not. And that kind of came around to what I call the civic engagement framework. And I don't work with glass. I thought I heard somebody with the glass. I was going to say that would be something that happened to me. So the civic engagement framework takes some of these base ideals from George Lake Paul, particularly in his work. Don't think like an elephant. Anybody ever heard of that book? It was popular in the early 2000s, maybe late 1990s. George Lake Paul was a philosopher and political thinker and linguist thinker who talked about how a lot of metaphors in conservative and progressive ideology really were kind of based in two different worldviews. They call it street father and nurture parent worldview. And I kind of took some of those ideals and I kind of saw them in a lot of the public engagement activities. Some of the things that he was talking about that were being replicated in the ways that meetings and public engagement. So really started from that and kind of using it as a frame to see which kind of ideals, what kind of practices, what kind of identities and things like that, are endemic to different types of engagement and how that legitimizes and delegitimizes it. And this framework has two frameworks, just like this. What's one is called strict father. The strict father worldview is basically a worldview that the world is a dangerous place. So we have to sort of invest all of our decision making in a single moral authoritarian decision maker. And when we come together to make decisions, we're all competing for one ideal to be won. So it's very much based on this ideal of dominance and submission, ideal of legitimacy, one ideal, one worldview, legitimacy of none, all based on the idea that like we have to protect what we have. And then there are ideals based on nurture and parent, which acknowledges that the world has its dangers, but also says that there are possibilities. We can work together, we can work with one another. Collaborative decision making is a key part of it. And I realize I'm over here, not over here, you can hear me. Sorry about that, Martin. And also that communication and understanding are key, particularly when we're talking about meetings. So I think when you look at these two types of frames, the strict father and nurture parent, many of us can probably think about times when we've been at meetings that have felt like both of those meetings, either because of the outcomes or because of whose voice matters or just because of how it was run, right? Like a lot of us can think about that. But I started to like really think about what were the specific things that really embodied those two frameworks. And I came up with three basic sort of platforms or spaces where those ideals show up in how people are meeting together in public engagement. First, there were what I call citizen identities, and these are the identities that tend to carry the most weight in different types of meetings and public engagement. So, the citizens' identities that I talked about in my story were owner and consumer, neighbor, and advocate. And you can think about how those identities mean different things, whether we're in a homeowners association meeting, a city council meeting, maybe a protest, maybe a neighborhood meeting. Which one of those identities we might want to put forward if we're going to ask for legitimacy about how we're talking and speaking. Then there's laws, regulations, and policy, and this is a really broad way because, like, if I put all of my ideas about these on this slide, the slide would like 10 slides long. It's crazy. But in general, strict father types of meetings, public engagements tend to have more restrictive laws, regulations and policies, and sometimes that's based off of just legal requirements, right? There's some meetings, particularly if they're city, particularly if they are, they are official meetings of some sort. There may be only so many things officials can do, even if they want to give more voice or change rules or laws. It's hard to be flexible. And then there are the nurturing parent kinds of meetings that are more expansive. The rules are a little bit more flexible. These are usually what you find in community meetings, or maybe sometimes like charrettes or other types of things where you can kind of make up meetings on your own. Those tend to be my favorite, but that's just my own political commentary. And finally, practices. We talked about it before, how in strict father meetings, the practices and outcomes tend to be about competitive outcomes, winner take all, one right way of doing things out of many. There's a competition for time to talk. Usually the time for public comment is smaller. So there's competition in terms of getting to that microphone. Wherein more nurturing parent, there's more of a emphasis on collaboration, giving everybody a voice, coming to maybe a third or fourth solution, a plan B, plan D, plan Z, if you come to it, and also capacity building and self-actualization and learning for everybody involved. So there's usually more of an emphasis on learning more about the process, even as you're in a process. And so we'll talk more about this framework later, but just keep that in mind as we're talking further and further about some of the things that we're talking about in terms of findings and things like that, in terms of whose voice matters and whose doesn't, and how that happens. Even if we want everybody's voice to matter, sometimes the structures that we're in don't lend themselves to that. Now we'll turn it back over to Jim.
Thank you. And so you can start to see how, if we think of those organizations, right, in that field and how they're connected, and how the cultural frame starts to impact the interpretation of the different forces in that field. And so we kind of brought these two frameworks together to answer that question of what are the qualities of inclusive and equitable public participation? Taking advantage of the variation that you would find, that we would expect to find given the conceptual framework we're using across the area commissions. And so this is a multi-site case study, and we collected data across all area commissions, but then we also did 4 deep dives into these 4 sites. We wanted to select sites that had that we would expect to see variation in their environment. Part of that was, commissions that have different relationships with the city. So thinking about those connections within the policy field. Also about varying demographics and varying development pressure. And so we sought to select 4 deep dives that would give us enough variation to be able to answer our question around what are those environments that citizens are showing up, what do they like, and what are the expectations there. We collected quite a bit of data. You probably noticed on that first slide, we had a lot of authors on this. It was a big group, it was a big team. We collected things like number of building permits, demographics, so some secondary data. We collected a bunch of documents, city code, the city's best recommendation practices for area commission, city bulletins, 10 years of city bulletins that we read and coded. Because within city bulletins, you can see where an area commission comes with a recommendation and you see the city's decision. So are the city and the area commission agreeing, which, by the way, is remarkable that what we found 8 cases of disagreement over the years. We don't know what's happening before that decision, but only 8 that made that were reported.
So they could be critical projects.
They could be huge, but they're only yeah, and local newspapers. We sat down with area commission liaisons, that connective tissue between the city's interpretive neighborhoods and the area commissions themselves. And we spent about 56 hours in observation of area commission meetings. And we did about 40 interviews with area commissioners and others that are engaged in the process. All right. So I already mentioned this is a case study centering, multi-site case study centering on the phenomenon of area commission environments in which citizens engage. We did a document analysis across all those documents I was mentioning. We did extensive memoing while, during, and after our observations as part of our analytical process. Coding, we used two different coding approaches. Structural coding, which is really just taking the framework that Kip presented and coding to that framework and how we saw it coming through in area commission work. And more emergent coding, which is capturing themes that we weren't expecting to see or things that kind of came up during our study that were related to our question, but were not part of the initial deductive coding. And then we use something called dialogical intersubjectivity. And you're like, what is that? That is a lot of time, and I mean a lot of time, where the research team spends in dialogue, coming to consensus on the findings. Deliberation between members of the research team creates shared meaning and understanding of the data and how it relates to our research question and the overall purpose of the study. We began the deliberative process in February of 2021. We stopped that process 13 months later, and we were meeting oftentimes every week to pour over what was going on. And we attended to research quality in many different ways. The first is thinking about external validity. We use a theory-based framework. We did prolonged engagement, and I gave you some examples when I was talking about data collection. We triangulated between investigators, and we triangulated between sources. We phased our data collection, iterating between data collection and analysis to enable adjustments and refinements to make sure we had more comprehensive data. We peer debriefed with people in the Department of Neighborhoods who are our collaborators on this grant. We sent early findings out to area commissioners themselves to look at the results. We conducted consensus-based coding, and we made sure to ground all of our findings, and you see this both in the report that came out and also the journal article that we wrote. We grounded our findings in examples. All right, so on to those findings. Yeah, pass it back to Kip. And don't worry, you'll see more of Glennon too.
Exactly. Here in a moment. Exactly.
Yeah.
I do feel like it's like a review. Like I'm back here, we'll like Glennon coming up. But first, here's a message from our sponsors. Findings. So what did we find? I mean, we did, like Jill talked about, detailed a long data collection and particularly sense-making process afterwards. I'm really proud of it because it really helped us to sort of solidify a lot of the ideals that we were talking about. So a lot of the frameworks and theoretical knowledge that Jill and I were talking about earlier, moving that to theory, to the real, right? To real experiences that we were able to witness, that we were able to record, and really come together with some findings that I think were really powerful for not only the area commissions specifically, but also the way we think about civic engagement in Central Ohio more broadly. And so I want to detail a few of those. I'm not going to get too deep in the woods because we have a lot of findings and they're pretty deep, but I want to give you just a flavor. And I want to start with the findings specific to the civic engagement framework. So, like Jill talked about, with the framework, we ended up sort of turning that into a code. We turned it into a rubric of different characteristics of what those frames would look like in terms of practices, in terms of the identities that people are holding in terms of some of the outcomes, sort of based off of things that tend to happen in meetings. And we actually went out and observed, like Joe was talking about, we observed meeting 4 different area commissions and kind of saw where things in the framework were happening, whether it was father or nurturing parent, just to kind of, see and evaluate this framework to a certain extent, but also see how it works in practice. And, what we found was kind of a discongruity between what people wanted and what was happening. So when we did interviews with different stakeholders, whether they be commissioners or people coming to meetings or other stakeholder liaisons, everybody wanted, a majority, a large majority of people wanted area commission meetings where everybody felt comfortable coming and speaking and sharing and felt like they had a seat at the table. But a lot of times we were seeing a lot of sort of strict father, very restrictive and very competitive environments in area commissions. And what it kind of came down to was the fact that between all of those stakeholders, what the area commission was doing, what it was supposed to be doing, and what it had to do, the ideal of it was vague between a lot of people. A lot of people didn't exactly know what area commissions were or weren't supposed to do. And what that led to, which is kind of not surprising when you start thinking about it, is kind of a retreat into, sort of dominant culture, identity practices, and expertise, which, is strict father. And what happened was that retreat into strict father often led to inequitable engagement environments, whether people wanted them to or not. This is something that happens in civic engagement and public discourse that I see very often as somebody who does a lot of research is good-hearted people who do want expansive engagement environments, but are locked into systems that make it very difficult for us to do that and very difficult for us to see and make course changes when we do see it. And so because everyone had a different conception of what an area commission meeting was, the easiest thing to do is to slide back into what we know. And unfortunately, what we know in our culture are meetings that have kind of a strict father thing, particularly in formal atmospheres like area commissions or like a city council meeting or something like that. And so I'm not going to go over each one of the points that we had in terms of the rubric about strict father and nurturing parent, but just to talk about a few of them and where we saw them. So a strict adherence to dominant structure that, allow for community volatility and legitimacy. So, these sort of structures that kind of give legitimacy to some people and not certain people. I'm going to get back in front of this too so I can read. Commissions usually emulated city council in their zoning processes to speed up and streamline meetings. And so there wasn't really a lot of space to deliberate. Also, a lot of meetings emphasize efficiency in terms of engagement opportunities through things like, short time limits for people to kind of talk. Some meetings had like a 3 or 5 minute timer for people to be able to share. And there were a lot of people who needed to share because in a lot of cases, the area commissions are the only place to engage with the city that they know of. And so, people were not only wanting to engage about zoning things, but also about other things as well. In terms of nurturing parent, there were some things that we saw that did fit into that. In some places, in some area commissions, particularly those with less zoning pressure, community problems and solutions, were connected to community success. So these are sort of prioritizing building equitable relationships. Young kids were more invited to the meetings, and more emphasis was put on the success of children or the success of maybe even seniors in the community. There was also more of an acceptance of varieties of experience. Emotion, as we'll talk about later, is sometimes difficult for area commissions or anyone who's adjudicating a public meeting to deal with. I mean, we were talking about that when Glennon was talking about the environment that we're in. We're in a very emotional environment when we're talking about engagement, and sometimes it's difficult to handle. But some meetings in the area commission were really good about accepting sort of emotional memory and emotional story as part of the legitimate fact finding or legitimate information about a place, particularly when people were talking about their personal histories in the community. This one was, using emotional memories and examples of street naming, and so using that as part of naming streets. And then finally, promoting participant empowerment and learning. We talked about that earlier. So having engagement in environments that are not just about coming to engage what we're engaging about, but also building our capacity to be better civic engagers, public decision makers going forward. So, the Far East Area Commission specifically, we're good at calling on people during meetings to do real-time problem solving. Not the only one, but certainly one of them. And different meetings, some of the few meetings recognize and uplift skills and abilities of participants. Now, as I've noted these, I would probably say that these nurturing parent things, unfortunately, were more the exception rather than the norm. Some of the strict father things that we talked about earlier were more the norm. But as I said before, it's not due to any real desire to it. It's really because people are working in a system that is vague, and we fall back on the methods that we know the most. But there were people who were. There are examples that we can follow in the future for different.
And also, the Far East had the fewest number of variance requests, so they had the least amount of zoning work to do, which meant they had time to do other things. And they had less pressure on the time for the meeting.
Which was like a really big top level finding, and one that makes a lot of sense, right? Along with the vagueness that we were talking about, time pressures also are another spot where you sort of fall back on the knowledge that they have coming out of a lot of implicit bias knowledge. Okay, exactly, connecting the dots. And so, those are things to kind of keep in mind in terms of why a lot of strict, father meetings, a lot of meetings where there was a lack of voice or a tightening of the space for more voice were there. Once again, more because of the structure rather than any individual desire for that, which is important when we're thinking about how to make connections. And we'll keep going through that with findings as well. So in terms of some general structure, I broke it down into 4 different groups. Once again, I'm not going to share all the findings, there were a lot of them, but just some top level findings. First, about structure. Currently, area commissions offer no forum for neighborhood discussions or grievances, or very few of them. Like we were talking about, when zoning pressures are high, as they are in Columbus, which is a growing city, it's already difficult to do that. And area commissions are predicated on adjudicating zoning variance requests. That's their primary goal. So they really weren't built to have a large functionality for larger neighborhood discussions or grievances. But like we talked about, since there aren't a lot of other ways to have that sort of conversation with the city, a lot of ways that people know about, area commissions kind of become that de facto place something. We found that meeting structures were often relying on practices that favor efficiency over deliberation. Once again, just because, zoning variance adjudication is a big part of it. And so, efficiency is a really big point, but it often does come at the expense of voice. And unfortunately, that voice usually tends to be the people who have the least power outside of meetings as well, which tends to mean Black and brown people, other minorities, and other people who are marginalized in other ways. Area commissioners often felt reporting feeling stressed by the amount of zone requests. Kind of goes back to what we were talking about, that many area commissions are working for each meeting, particularly in places where there was just a lot of zoning, but even in places that there weren't, balancing zoning requests and variance requests with having other community conversations was seen as a challenge. So in terms of participation, one of the big findings we did this, like Jill was talking about, sort of in the thrust of the lockdown during the pandemic. And during that time, the city was holding area commissions were holding a lot of telemeetings, and the city in general. And what happened was that kind of a thing that nobody really thought about as a side effect is that it brought a lot more people to area commission meetings that would not have come otherwise, because area commission meetings are sometimes, at times that people can't necessarily make. Sometimes they're in places that people can't necessarily make all the time. They might conflict with other types of things that we're doing. And, the telemeetings made it possible for people to engage, and I believe they were recorded, right, as well. So, people could attend even outside of that as well. And while that engagement was sort of based off of a temporary ruling for that, and kind of conflicted with existing public meeting rules, we did find that a lot of people talked about tele-engagement as a way of that they were brought into engagement and kind of widening that voice and widening that space for engagement. In terms of process, this is where we're talking specifically more about the place of emotion within public meetings. And I think this is a larger scale thing, particularly with more official or formalized public meetings, right? Is that there really isn't a called out space for emotional information or emotional conversation. And so commissioners felt that they were kind of expected to act as an adjudicator, an emotionalist adjudicator, and that they were leaving their emotions at the door. Remember, our area commissions are neighbors. They are community residents. They have an emotional relationship with this community, just like the people who come. And a lot of commissioners felt like they were asked to sort of excise that part of themselves. And as a result, they felt ill-equipped to manage conflict in their meetings when emotions showed up because they're not supposed to be emotional. And so for that reason and for just other reasons of lack of feeling like they have a lack of capacity for that information, for that kind of adjudication, they felt like it was difficult to adjudicate emotions, and emotions are part of the experience that people have with their community, particularly when there's a challenge or there's a problem. Emotions can run high, and many commissioners felt they didn't have they weren't equipped to deal with it very well. And finally, in terms of recruitment, one of the things that we found out was commissioners tended to recruit via established networks of those already represented. And this really comes out of network theory. Most positions, are recruited through existing networks that people have, whether it be public sector, private sector, volunteers, and what have you. But in this particular case, many of the commissioners were concerned that because of that process of recruiting commissioners, some people in the community were left out, particularly marginalized populations within their boundaries who may not have access to those networks at times. And so those were some of the general findings that we had. And I'm going to turn it over to
Oh,
Glenn?
well,
Yeah.
Joe, I was just going to add.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I wasn't looking over there.
I'm just going to add that also those emotions can be very deep-seated emotions that come from decades and decades prior of a development relationship that even you might not have experienced yourself, but you are part of that narrative of a community. And so the argument might be about a zoning decision at that moment, but the source of that might be decades before. So.
And so we did offer a suite of recommendations to the city. And I do want to say that the city, we worked with the Department of Neighborhoods, where the area commissions run through, and they were wonderful partners. We worked very closely with David Huey and with Carla Scott Williams and also with Todd throughout this project. And the city wanted to know, how they can improve the engagement spaces, which is really awesome. And so I do just want to put that out there that the city was a wonderful partner in this. I also just want to say, this is a finding we didn't put on the slide, that, we did a survey of area commissioners and we asked them about their motivation. And area commissioners want to do good by their community, overwhelmingly. And that's important to remember too. These are people who are volunteering, right? And so, we might have area commissions implementing strict fodder. As you can see, the reasons for that are often structural and have to do with process and things like that, and the number of variance requests they're getting. So I just wanted to put that out there. So in terms of our recommendations, the first recommendation was actually kind of three in kind of lumped together, and it's really establishing a clarity of purpose for area commissions so that everyone is on the same page. And so even within, and so this would include, within the Department of Neighborhoods and other relevant departments that deal with the issues area commissions deal with, make sure there are clear lines of authority, and potentially limit the purpose and scope of area commissions to levels appropriate for what those city goals and resources and departmental responsibilities are. To provide trainings and resources to area commissioners who are members of the zoning subcommittee to ensure that they have the expertise required to fully participate and make decisions grounded in knowledge of zoning and planning practices. And then formalized lines of authority between area commissions and the appropriate city departments based on the purpose and scope. And so this is really getting at that kind of confusion that Kip talked about at the beginning about kind of what is the purpose of the area commission. We also, suggest in the city provide mechanisms for residents to engage in non-land use but neighborhood relevant issues. And so I serve on a suburban community relations commission. It does not do the same thing Columbus's does. Columbus's community relations commission deals with non-discrimination violations. My community relations commission outsources this. We do a good neighbor award. We hear community grievances. We do like a neighborhood community grant program. We do community relations in the community. And maybe there's a need for something like that. Should area commissions be playing both of these roles? Essentially is the question there. We also suggest they expand those tele-engagement and other remote engagement opportunities because more people were showing up when that was an option during the pandemic. Also invite and engage participant lived experience into area commissions, which means we need to help equip area commissioners to deal with conflict because conflict is inevitable in land use decisions, especially when you're an area under intense growth pressures like we are. And when you have people like the people in Columbus who love their neighborhoods and communities so much. Also create processes to actively recruit commissioners outside of those current networks, right? With the objectives of creating inclusive environments for engagement, right? And so how can we kind of step outside of those normal networks where we invite people? And a lot of times it's because these people are showing up in meetings concerned about issues anyways, right? How can we step outside of that and engage different people in these meetings so we can get better representation of these communities, right? Another thing too, right? If we want equity, we need to pay area commissioners. And so I'm going to go on my soapbox for a moment here. Boards and commissions provide crucial functions for cities. Cities cannot operate well without what boards and commissions do. And if we want equity and we want true representation on boards and commissions, we have to figure out a way to make it possible for people to participate. And one way is paying people. It's critical work for the city, so it should be work that is paid. I'll stop now. We also, so area commissions can set their own election day. All right. And a lot of them, some of them will align them to existing community events. One thing we actually recommend, though, is creating a citywide election day and then promote it. The city can promote it. It can be something that is promoted citywide. It can be known citywide, and it might get some greater participation among citizens and invite people who didn't even know area commissions existed into this process so they can learn and engage with their community better. I do want to talk for a moment about zoning and zone in that's happening in Columbus. So Columbus is redoing their zoning code, for those of you who don't know. And so one of the reasons that we had, particularly in 3 of our cases, so many variance requests is because these are old neighborhoods. In the 1950s, and Todd had nothing to do with this, I don't think he was working here now. But the city of Columbus took a suburban zoning code and slapped it on all these urban neighborhoods. The lots are literally more narrow than the zoning code requires. Everything requires a variance when that is the case. The new zoning code will fix that and other regulatory issues that will make, that will make fewer variance requests and less work for area commissions, which might actually free up time for area commissions to focus on things that people in their communities care about that might not be directly related to zoning requests. So I do want to invite my co-authors up to talk about where we want to take this work. And we want to engage you guys in this. So a couple of the things we've thought about is investigating other planning commissions, including historic planning commissions, because I'm a planner by education, and we know that historic designation has been used in some cases to gentrify neighborhoods. And so what do those look like? I also think it'd be really cool to look at suburban commissions. And I think it'd be really cool to also look at all those grassroots racial and social justice advocacy groups who sprung up like between 2016 and 2022. They're in every suburb in Central Ohio. And many of them have formed 501c3s and they're official nonprofits. And, they think they're doing, I want to see how they're actually operating. I think it'd be interesting, but we'd really like to know what you guys think and where we should take this work to. And we'd like to open it up for questions.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I'm gonna go to the next slide because you can scan the QR code and access our report on that. But we still would like to hear your thoughts, if you have any thoughts on where we should take this work, and if you have any questions.
Oh, shoot.
Oh, do you need to say something?
She's gonna give the close on this.
No, let's do questions first. Yeah. If there are any questions, are there any questions? Can you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
There's a question in the chat, and I think it was asked us why we're thinking about area of reviews. I believe discussing this the question is, did you find that there were significant contact with commissioners outside of the public meeting by the first?
So like what people developers, people wanting to do business with the area commission?
Yeah, just
I think that's.
yeah, I think.
Yeah.
We didn't ask that.
Yeah, we didn't ask specifically.
No, but I will say that there was a difference between commissioners that were really tied into development networks
Mhm.
and it was just by virtue of their work,
Mhm.
spend a lot of time with people in the development community.
Yeah.
Now, individual citizens, I'm not sure.
And
Mhm.
some area commissions are more kind of development heavy in terms of who's on them. They have more people related to the development industry than others, and those area commissions might behave differently than others.
Yeah, I think this is the sea change that our work kind of highlights is that, I think the way we think about these connections between individuals working in public services, like, very deliberate, right? Like, oh, I'm meeting with you because we have several interests and it's, a smoke-filled room or something like that. But really it is more about, the networks that we happen to be in. Columbus is a town of networks, right? And, we joke between the three of us that depending on which meeting we are, we just have different roles because we talk to one another. And it's like that with a lot of people. People are tied into different networks and connections, and that, automatically puts them more in front of different people than they would have. And it gives them more access to or more effect from the different norms and beliefs and power and ideals within those networks.
And if you ask commissioners, well, how did you get to this work? It was like, because someone asked me.
Yes.
And that is, that's remarkable that people can leverage their networks to get volunteers from the neighborhood, but also it has some effects when it comes to both the mindset that's brought to meetings, because you're part of the same networks, you've got the same norms and stuff, but also, to kind of getting outside and looking to what a lot of the commissioners would say they were looking for, which is better representation.
Mhm.
Pretty universally, commissions wanted to be representative of their neighborhoods.
Oh, yeah.
We
They want
were
to be equitable. Yeah.
And I think what we were bringing to the conversation is there's representation and there's inclusion. And the environment within which you meet can be more inclusive.
Exactly. And that goes to the part in the survey that we asked, and I'm not going to remember all the specifics, but people, commissioners were, volunteering because they were asked, but even the ask was different depending on sort of what networks they were in. Some people were asked because to protect neighborhood values or ideals, or some people were asked in order to bring change to the community, or some people were asked to sort of represent groups that may have not other been representative. And so all of those are the same types of things of being asked from the network you're in. But even that has differences depending that kind of play into like the civic engagement framework too.
We have any questions in the room?
Or thoughts or comments or anything?
Yeah.
Straight up. This is really interesting for me. I know a lot of people here in community work for 2 years now. Did a regular job, like in Columbus and such. There are things called neighborhood civic association. That's really block. Those are some of the groups that have been around for a long time. There are a lot more recent ones that I was talking about that form too. And I ran a Marion Village Association for 20 years. Maybe because no one else wanted to do it. I was involved in helping to get the Southside Area Commission designed and created, and then a little bit later, I was on it for 9 years. And I can tell you, it's going to be interesting. I mean, in my life, in many ways, but I was at meetings constantly. You know, the commission really had something big commission, but it's the whole range of it. But part of the reason I like the fact that we had an area commission. When I first started, there wasn't an area commission there, but there was a group that sort of functioned like it, but it wasn't officially recognized as a city. And we felt as much clout or city responses, being responsiveness. So we created this commission. It's controversial. Everything's this stuff. But one of the things I liked about our neighborhood, it's adjacent to downtown, adjacent to Marion Village. There's a whole lot of gentrification and development going on in parts of it, and in other parts of it, it's very poor. We had 15 different districts within our neighborhood. Each of those had a different, at least one different civic association. One area had 4, overlapping boundaries that are constantly fighting. You get this eclectic mix of things. But one of the things that did get present over time was the way zoning became the dominant. And what I'm curious about, and I promise I'll but what I'm curious about, and your thoughts too, is with this rezoning, the zoning thing that just happened over the last 12 months with the city, first time in 70 years. Part of the goal was to reduce the number of variances because it takes so much time and there's a lot of pressure from the development community. So you have to do things fast, which we do. But there are reasons why community folks show up meetings about variances because they're interested in their opinion. And it'll be interesting to see how commissions function when there's less of a zoning piece of it, and you may see more. I mean, it'll just be interesting to see. But one of the things that was helpful for me, I know, in running Marion Village and being part of the broader commission, it was it was a way to really better understand what goes on in my case, east of Parsondale, or farther south of there, and to figure out ways to partner and to try to work, with groups that aren't as well established, or different groups that maybe are left and don't have engaged, aren't as engaged and stuff. So anyway, I commend you for this kind of work. I remember, because I'm old, I remember before the Department of Neighborhoods was created, and I think the department is a great idea.
I remember that too, but I'm not old.
So maybe you're not as old as you think.
One thing that we didn't mention is that area commissions are created by people in the neighborhood. That is how the city does not say this is we're going to create an area commission here. People in the neighborhood have to create the area commission, and then the city will work with them. And one thing I think is interesting is that there really aren't area commissions on the north side of Columbus. And I live on the farm. Before doing this study, I was thinking about starting one. But I also have been reading a lot of radical planning theory, and so now I'm not going to.
We have another online question. What about the room?
Yeah, a lot of trees and ways, so our returns and having those commissioners, and so, one of the things I'm taking away from this is looking at some of our processes and how a lot of them are very restrictive and following, part of the law, you're noticing, hearing the public meeting, all of the order. And so how do you encourage public participation, things that are, drawing the crowds, drawing things that it's important to do that. So thinking more critically about those kind of things. But also with the knowing about the area commission process. A lot of it sometimes has been about the time. So I the positions in the past about developer has to be public friends, they have to talk to them. So a lot of that, like, forming relationships, and that's a big part of it, and, hopefully something that continues to go on in this relationship, even with the resiliency. My question I have is about, were there any changes in the dynamic of city officials, like they're appointed, attending these meetings, so like the council person or director of an agency or something that, how do you kind of like that?
Yeah, I don't know if we asked that specifically.
Or if we didn't, I'm trying to think of all the meetings that I went to.
Yeah,
I can't remember, like the liaison would be there from the city of every time, I think.
Yeah.
Liaison.
And there would be different people representing maybe like, Parks and Rec, that would be there. I don't remember any elected. But I do remember, people from different agencies.
Yeah, I haven't seen any elected, and I've even been in some recent Near East Side Area Commission meetings, and like they had folks from like the city attorney, assistant attorney came for the Latitude 25 to present about that. So area commissions will frequently have like informational presentations from the city or about things going on in their area as well. Like, and a lot of them will do that in committee. Like they'll have regular committee meetings, so they might have those in their community engagement committee meeting, because in the zoning committee meeting, they're doing site visits and they're, talking about what their recommendations are gonna be to the broader commission so they can make decisions. Sorry, I walked away.
No.
I get excited.
Just kind of building off of something you said, like, let's look at the format of the meeting. And what are those little adjustments that can be made that enable people to make it less efficient Robert's rules oriented and more people centered? There can be some simple adjustments that can start to create a culture around that.
PTAs would be fascinating to investigate.
That would be,
Like,
yeah.
you saw it on the
Like where the country is.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, even outside of the actual meeting, sometimes there's spaces like maybe how we connect with people who've attended afterwards, or how we connect before, or what sort of practices we have sort of outside of the space where our engagement is relegated, right? Or regulated. I keep saying regulated. That those are things that I think we don't always think about, but could make a big difference too.
Charlie?
Yeah, first of all, it's excellent presentation. Thank you very much. And this work is, I'm sure you'll agree, extremely important. Not too many things are more important than who seeks to be engagement, particularly in our so that's just an idea of
Did it turn off?
that's just some ideas of places you might want to approach, but too much, a little bit of experience in all this, that sometimes it's easier to start small and tweak what you're doing. That's why I think of BTAs or homeowner associations, both of which I think are in enormous need of more inclusive civic engagement.
And for those who don't know, homeowners associations were created by early planned suburban developers for the purpose of enforcing restrictive covenants, which include racial restrictions, and mainly the racial part of the covenants after they were illegal. So they knew that they were going to be challenged and were a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So like that is why homeowners associations were originally created. To make neighborhoods exclusive and keep people out.
But they still exist, and they're in many they're part of deeds, and they've got to operate, they have to have dues, and they tend to be uninclusive in the sense that
Some
excluded
interesting,
because
interesting reading, the Northwest Arlington Association, Google that for Upper Arlington. There's some interesting stuff they did in the past. They violated the Fair Housing Act.
Yeah,
A lot of really good environments to look at. And I'm like thinking back, like when we were talking about area commissions, for this initial study, what it helped us do was to take a singular phenomenon, the area commission with a singular code, and watch it play out really differently depending on which commission you were working with, to help us start to articulate a lot of what you see, what you saw in Kip's framework. But now that we've done that work, you know, we can go to maybe ones that have maybe not so much kind of horizontal connective tissue, because one of the big things is these neighborhoods have different memories of what it's like to be in the city, right?
Yeah.
And those memories predate people even that are showing up at the meetings today, that those memories are still alive. So anyway, it's just kind of making me think that I love the PTA.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Far East Area Commission is the youngest in terms of when those homes were built.
Mhm.
So in terms of the zoning, it's more aligned with the zoning code because it was built around the time that, like, a lot of those neighborhoods are active. And, I don't know, and, you know, so they don't have as many variance requests, which means they had time in their meeting. So they didn't have to implement the 3-minute, you know, limit on speaking, and they could discuss it. And they did. They were really, I mean, they would deliberate with each other.
Yeah, and I mean, oh, sorry. Oh, I was gonna say too, that just a point to that point, like, you know, we were always thinking about the larger question, even as we were doing this with area commissioners, is, you know, what are the lessons that we can learn for people who are meeting in a lot of different spaces? Because we are in a moment where public meeting is kind of fraught, right? Like, one of the things we heard from interviews, aside from the efficiency and the time, is like, I just don't want to go to a public meeting because, like, you know, people are angry and shouting and it's tiring. And I think we are all maybe collectively in the space looking for some different, you know, ways and platforms and norms and behaviors for meeting together as neighbors. And that's why I love, like, starting from like the you know, the framework that you framed in terms of, like, you know, these fields of how we come together and make decisions and the norms and ideals about them. I don't think we really thought about them for a long time. And hopefully this is a chance, you know, even, you know, in the city and amongst us to really think about, like, what are the behaviors and norms that are inclusive that we want to be in our public meetings going forward. You know, we zone in, I think that's going to be a good opportunity for us to really have that reflexive conversation about how we come together in the city. And I mean, that's where I hope that we can sort of take these lessons beyond area commissions, also area commissions, because it's important, but also, you know, to how we're engaging even at the sublevel, that too.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Investing in nonprofit community social justice programs. I am sort of forced to and I got the opportunity to visit almost every area commission of the university. I worked in nonprofit work, and so, you know, I think one of our greatest weaknesses that we see things as I black or white and local with. You know, watching see top down and bottom trying to do. And so when we put our communities and the people's area first and invest our time and money into them, then they feel they have a stake in the next people who makes it out of this suggestion that you have.
Well, and if you're thinking about the more people-centered, if your reaction to people bringing themselves to a meeting, and that means everything along and why they're concerned in the first place, if your reaction to that is to restrict, right, and to get very formal and very procedural to try and manage the person showing up, that's not going to go well. And so, yeah, it's like,
Do we have another online question?
There is, the area commissions still create plans for the neighborhood to come.
Do they?
So the area commission still
Do they
create
still?
plans for the neighborhood to come.
No.
Actually, I just came from a meeting, through the area commission for putting a community plan for the eastern area. The area commission is a very involved and participating as the city doing processes, but they themselves are like hiring consultants and whatnot to create.
Well, typically the city intentionally seeks them out to engage in the planning process as well. And then I'll also just plug, engage in the zoning process. Because now the city is focusing on residential zoning. And residential, like zoning codes, are value statements. They are literally the most important value statement a city can make. They say who we want to live in our city, what businesses we want to thrive in our city, and who we want to invite to spend money and enjoy our city. That's what zoning codes say. And in Ohio, because we're so reliant on income tax, right, that they create a blueprint for potential revenue sources. Those revenues translate to city services. City services are a reflection of citizen value. Zoning codes are value statements. You want your values included, so you guys should get it.
Well, one of your slides indicated you didn't want white old men. I mean, 3 and the 4.
Do you have any other questions?
Are you, no, I think he just been holding it. No, if he has an actual question.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you so much to our speakers. Our next fall forum event will be on September 26th. Dr. Miranda Martinez, the Associate Professor in the Department of Comparative Studies at OSU, will be presenting with Dr. Kendrick Roberson, who is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at Pepperdine University. And they will be presenting in a talk called Judicial Foreclosures and Appraisals, Biases Impact on Black Home Ownership, and that is on September 26th during the lunch hour. We look forward to everyone joining us. If you're interested in learning more about the work Kerwin does and upcoming events, please follow us on our website to get on our email list. And thanks for coming.
I think that's